Welcome back to Radical Engagements, and we're continuing our long march through JudgeSabo's discussion of Engels' on authority. We are in the socialist futures section. I see us getting through parts 1 and 2 and maybe parts 3 of that, but there's a lot more parts in this one, and we'll get into that. You remember you can find the text in the show notes, and I would strongly suggest you watch the other things and also maybe my critique and reading of On Authority as well. There are some things I disagree with JudgeSabo on, or I think he's being a little bit too cutting to the chase in ways that I might find slightly problematic, but in general, I think this has been helpful so far, and let's continue down that path. The Socialist Future, The Authority of Machines, Part 1. Block quote here from Engels. When examining the economic, industrial, and agricultural conditions which form the basis of present-day bourgeois society, we find that they tend to be more and more to replace isolated action by combined action of individuals. Modern industry, with its big factories and mills, where hundreds of workers supervise complicated machines driven by steam, have superseded small workshops of separate producers. The carriages and wagons of the highway have become substituted by rail trains, just as small schooners and sailing feluccas have been by steamboats. Even agriculture falls increasingly under the dominion of the machine and of steam, which slowly but relentlessly push in the place of small proprietors by big capitalists with the aid of hired workers cultivate vast stretches of land. Parts of this are still true, parts of this are not. I talk about this in my critique of this text, that there's things that the Engels is almost wiggishly projecting into the future that just aren't true. But beyond that, there's other internal problems with it, and that's where JudgeSabo is going to go. Okay, quoting JudgeSabo. Engels begins by examining the current tendencies of production in, quote, present-day bourgeois society of capitalism out of which future socialist society will grow. The main tendency he focuses on in capitalism is replacing systems where workers are relatively isolated with ones where they are brought together for large-scale industry using the combined action of individuals. Thus, the small workshops are replaced by big factories. This tendency goes hand in hand with technological change. The isolated production of artisans, carriages, and small proprietors are replaced by complex machines attended by hundreds of workers. This is true not only of industrial production, but also of transportation and agriculture, asterisks, and this is Varn talking, until it's not. And so we go back to smaller levels of transportation, like the car as opposed to the train, nonetheless. By utilizing combined action, workers are able to achieve far more than they could in isolation. That's true. This point is consciously emphasized by Marx and Engels and can be especially seen in chapters 15 of Marx's Capital, 1867, for example. Just as the offensive power of the squadron of cavalry or the defensive power of the regiment of infantry is essentially different from the sum of the offensive power or defensive power of the individual cavalry or infantry soldiers taken separately, so the sum of the mechanical forces exerted by isolated workers differs from the social force that is developed when many hands take part simultaneously in one and the same undivided operation, such as raising a heavy weight, turning a winch, or removing an obstacle. In such cases, the effect of combined labor could not be produced at all by isolated individual labor, or could be produced only by great expenditure of time, or on a very dwarf scale. Not only have we an increase in the productive power of the individual by means of cooperation, but the creation of a new power, namely the collective power of the masses. End block quote. Earlier socialists have made similar points, having to develop Marx and Engels' understanding of this. There are some striking similarities, for example, in this idea of combined action or collective power and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's concept of collective force, which can be seen in Proudhon's What is Property, 1840. Quote, a force of 1,000 men working 20 hours a day has paid the same wages that one could be paid for working 55 years. But this force was 1,000 has done in 20 days what a single man could not accomplish though he had the labor of 1,000,000 centuries. Is the exchange an equitable one? Once more, no. When you have paid all the intended individual forces, the collective force still remains to be paid. Consequently, there remains always the right of collective property, which you have not acquired and which you enjoy unjustly. Unquote. Even apart from machinery, the advantage of combined action exists. Engels is not merely pointing to the existence of combined action, then, whether he is pointing to the development of tools that presuppose combined action. A field may be worked by one person for many, or for a few days by many people, but a factory can only be worked with combined action, as many different tasks need to be done simultaneously. Part 2, long quote from Engels. Everywhere combined action, the complication of processes dependent on each other displaces independent action by individuals. But whomever mentions combined action speaks of organization. Now, is it possible to have organization without authority? Question mark. Supposing a social revolution dethroned the capitalist, who now exercise their authority over production and circulation of wealth. Supposing, to adopt entirely the point of view of the anti-authoritarians, that land and the instruments of labor have become collective property of the workers who use them. Will authority have disappeared, or will have only changed form? Let us see. Now, I will just note, this is already a problem for that lack of clarification of what authority was in the beginning, because this is an authority of which no one has a lot of control. It's not an authority of will for sure, unless you believe that machines have will. And this is a problem because it's already made mincemeat of Engels' own definition. Engels maps out his first and primary argument. Society is moving towards greater combined action and production, which requires organization. But the organization requires authority. Therefore, even in a future socialist society where capitalists have been dethroned, authority will still need to be needed to make combined action possible. Anarchism then is fundamentally mistaken. It believes by abolishing the authority of the capitalist, it will have abolished the authority altogether. But since it will retain machines which presuppose combined action, this new society will need to be established an authority of its own in some new form. By directing their criticism against the principle of authority, the anarchists have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of socialism. It is a built-in assumption of this argument that the same tendencies Engels was witnessing in the 1800s will continue indefinitely, always towards greater combined action. No argument is given for this, and this seems like it could be challenged in at least two ways. I mean, also, it's challenged by the fact of history not doing what Engels says, but you can't know that at the time, so we should actually go through the arguments. Firstly, we might tend towards decreased combined action as we move towards greater automation. This is already a notable tendency within capitalism, throwing workers in unemployment. It was notable at the time. Secondly, that was me adding that. Secondly, if we still need to reproduce production in many areas due to the unsustainable and harmful practices of capitalist industry, something that is unsustainable cannot last forever by definition. Finite resources do not allow for infinite growth. The point is essentially made by the degrowth movement, or anyone who understands physics. I don't love the degrowth movement all the time, but this is a physics point, highlighting the massive levels of ecological damage being forced upon us by continuing to grow like this. That's me adding that. However, these objections do not strike at the heart of Engels' argument, even if they undermine its strength. Engels wants to give us a sense of inevitability here, where society must have factories because that's what he sees in capitalism. This is a very suspect claim, but even if it were not inevitable, the fact remains that anarchists generally don't reject combined action or collective force. Even anarcho-primitivists who explicitly advocate for the deindustrialization and abolishing of factories, and a lot of stuff, that's Barn talking, do not call for an end to combined action. Even if we reject Engels' technological determinism, then anarchists still need to address his argument about combined action. Asterisk. I think Saracen's rejection of reification in every instance leading to like the call for a redesigning of the human brain, which he did in a thought experiment in one essay and doesn't always hold that seriously. I wouldn't say that there would be some anarchists who reject combined action, but I bring that up just as the weird exception that actually proves the rule. So, nonetheless, part 3. Long Engels quote. Let us take, by the way of example, a cotton spinning mill. The cotton must pass through at least 6 successive operations before it's reduced to the state of thread. These operations take place for the most part in different rooms. Furthermore, the machines going require us an engineer to look after the steam engine. mechanics to make the current repairs, and other laborers whose business it is to transfer products from one room to another, and so forth. All these workers, men, women, and children, are obliged to begin and finish their workday at hours fixed by the authority of the steam, which cares nothing for the individual autonomy. What does will have to do with this then, Eagles? Nothing. All right, back to the text. The workers must then therefore come to an understanding on the hours of work, and these hours, once fixed, must be observed by all without exception. Engels illustrates his previous point about the need for combined action by describing technical requirements for operating a cotton spinning mill. For the miller one, workers need to perform different tasks simultaneously, which requires them to coordinate when they work. By aligning their schedules, they are completing jobs at fixed times relevant to each other. If they are not observed, quote, observed by all without exception, the factory cannot run. Because the factory cannot run without this coordination, the individual worker does not have the power to begin or end production whenever they please. Engels' family were industrial capitalists. They actually owned a large cotton textile mill, so there's a good chance that he is speaking from personal experience in this regard. Absolutely. That's why I'm talking. Engels describes the situation as hours of work being fixed by the authority of steam, which cares nothing for individual autonomy. Engels' first and primary example of an authority that will continue to exist in socialism is in the factory itself. This seems inconsistent with Engels' own definition of authority. Previously, he defined authority as the imposition of the will of another upon ours. But the cotton mill doesn't have any will of its own to impose. How can it be an authority? Hell yeah, JudgeSabo. How can it be an authority? This struck me too. It seemed like an equivocation. At first, it seems like Engels is using the first interpretation of impose that was ruled out. The factory acts as an authority here because we need to adapt our actions to the requirements of running it. This interpretation is only occasionally defended by online Marxists. Abolishing authority in this case would be absurd by as abolishing reality itself, since our options are as limited by our material conditions in some way. But if Engels really meant to be interpreted this way, and it seems like he could have made a much simpler argument. There are technical requirements for the spinning cotton, regardless of whether it's done by hundreds of workers in a mill or a single worker in a spinning wheel. All of the discussion is about the combined action could have been dropped. It seems more plausible that the interpretation of authority here needs to integrate combined action in a way in which the steam can be an authority. I will analyze more in the next section. Also notable in this section is the inclusion of child factory workers in the future idealized socialist economy. This seems to line up with Marx Engels' own demand in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which calls for free education for all children in public schools, abolition of children's factory labor in the present form, combination of education with industrial production, etc., etc. Marx seems to believe that child labor really was necessary for factories to function. He says it in Critique of the Goethe program too, by the way. And we're about to get there. And even viewed it as a positive good if it was paired with strictly regulating working time and proper safety measures. This can be seen as Critique of the Goethe program, 1875. A general prohibition of child labor is incompatible with the existence of large-scale industry, and it's an empty, pious wish. Its realization, if it were possible, would be reactionary, since strict regulation of working time according to different age groups and other safety measures for the protection of children, an early combination of productive labor with education is one of the most potent means of transformation in present-day society. I am unaware of any time anarchists have described child labor as necessary for large-scale industry, but the idea of children gaining work experience and combining education with industrial production was one that some anarchists shared, and also some progressives. John Dewey was always up on this shit. For example, the Swiss anarchist James Guillaume speculated in his idea of social organization, 1876, what education might look like in anarchy. Quote, we distinguish two stages in the education of children. The first stage, where children of 5 or 6 is not old enough to study science, and where the emphasis is on the development of physical faculties. And on the second stage, where children 12 to 16 of age will be introduced to the various divisions of human knowledge, while at the same time learning one or more crafts or trades through practice. Asterisk, what mouths can education actually did during the Cultural Revolution, interestingly enough. But anyway, back to this. Effectively, the idea here is that after abolishing a rigid capitalist division of labor, people would engage both mental and physical labor to become more well-rounded. The education system would reflect this with a mixture of theoretical and practical lessons received directly from workers who engage in both. This would include learning some basic tool use to repair their toys, as well as visiting various factories and even being taken on apprentice by factory workers. Asterisk. I actually still kind of believe we need to do something like this. And in some cases, even modern capitalist education does, but not consistently. Back to the text. A frequent anarchist injection on authority is that Engels appears to ignore the way factories have been intentionally designed to require certain capitalist abuses. This insistence on the necessity of child labor certainly seems like an instance of this. However, it does not actually strike to the core of Engels' argument, which is by far more focused on the need of combined action itself rather than the technical needs of factories as they were designed in the late 19th century. And let's go on one more section, part 4. Long quote from Engels. There are particular questions that arise here in each room and at each moment concerning the mode of production, the distribution of materials, etc., which must be settled by decision of a delegate placed at the head of each branch of labor, or, if possible, by majority vote. The will of a single individual will always be subordinate, will have to subordinate itself, which means that the questions are settled in an authoritarian way. Because the workers must coordinate their schedules together for when they work and what tasks they will do, operating a factory requires some degree of administration. Their job is maintaining the level of coordination, answering particular questions as they come up. Engels believes this type of administration can take two forms in socialism. It can either be tasked to a delegate or it can be determined by workers themselves through majority vote. He also mentions the possibility of a committee of delegates, which presumably combines these two options. Engels seems to leave out the possibility of a unanimous agreement amongst the workers. I think most people do, because consensus is really hard. Only leaving room for majority vote. Presumably, he does not. He does this because, given the number of workers in a factory, some level of disagreement will be inevitable and require a degree of compromise. Engels appears to believe that the very act of compromise, even when voluntarily agreed upon, constitutes a form of authority with which the will of another is being imposed upon our own. Administration is needed in a capitalist production too, of course, but there it is handled by capitalists themselves or the overseers they hire rather than by the workers or through their delegate. This is why Engels describes an authority as merely changed its form in a transition to socialism. The idea of administration tasks being handled by delegates chosen by the workers was something recognized by previous socialist authors writing about collective force as well. For example, take Bourdon, who wrote on what is property in 1840. But what every industry needs, and they will add leaders, instructors, superintendents, etc., and will be engaged in general tasks. No, since their task is to lead, instruct, and superintend, but they must be chosen from the laborers themselves by the laborers themselves and must fulfill the conditions of eligibility. It is the same with all public functions, whether administration or instruction. Unquote. In Engels' view, regardless of whether the workers used a delegate or majority vote, things are being settled in an authoritarian way. This is because, in either case, the will of the individual worker has been subordinated to a plan and instructions determined by delegates of majority of the workers. This will therefore be imposed upon the non-delegate workers of the minority. There seems to be a connective link between Engels' definition of authority and the authority of machine. I see at least two possible interpretations here. Firstly, we can interpret the authority machine as a purely poetic description of the administrator's authority in whatever form happens to take. By this reading, no actual authority is assigned to the machine at all. This interpretation avoids the oddity of assigning authority to a machine, which of course lacks any will to impose. Engels seems rather emphatic that it is really the machinery itself which holds the authority over the worker, as we see in the next section. Secondly, by describing the factory as an authority, Engels might simply mean that, by its very nature, it generates authoritarian social relations. In some sense, the workers really do relate to the factory as an authority, not just metaphorically, but in fact. The authority of the delegate or majority is a direct consequence and an extension of the authority of their own means of production ruling over them. This interpretation fits more with the plain reading of the text, but it does make it seem like Engels is altering the definition of authority to something like the imposition of a will of another upon ours are the material conditions which necessarily gives rise to that imposition. One reason this reading strikes me as more plausible is that Marx and Engels do have a history of attributing authority to machines in a distinct way from particular administrators. For example, in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, 1848, the worker is described as being enslaved by the machine, of which they become a mere appendage. Quote, Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character and consequently all charm for the workman. He has become a dependence on the machine and is only the most monotonous, and easily acquired knack that is required of him. Ellipses, still quote, the modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers crowded into the factory are organized like soldiers. As privates of the industrial army, of which they place in the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeois class and the bourgeois state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlooker, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer itself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. End quote. We can see clearly the distinction between the worker being enslaved by both the machine and by the overlooker, as they are considered separately. The idea of impersonal domination is actually something of a running theme in Marxist literature. See Soren Mao. And is usually tied to the idea of drudgery, alienation, fetishism, and the lack of social plan, leading people to be dominated by background processes. For example, in Capital, 1867, Marx describes how the value of commodities, quote, vary continually independently of the will, foresight, and action of the producers. To them, their own social actions take the form of the action of objects, which rule producers instead of being ruled by them. Michael Heinrich, I'm not sure I trust Heinrich on this, but whatever. Michael Heinrich elaborates on this passage in his introduction to 3 volumes of Marx's Capital, 2004, adding, this is Heinrich here, the value of commodities is an expression of an overall social interaction that cannot be controlled by individuals. In commodity and producing societies, people, all of them, are under control of things, and the decisive relations of domination are not personal but objective. This impersonal objective domination, submission to inherent necessities, does not exist because things themselves possess characteristics that generate such domination, or because social activity necessitates this through the mediation through things, but only because people relate to things in a particular way as commodities. Unquote. Engels attributing authority directly to the factory should not be seen as too out of place in the rest of Marxist thought. This also seems to show that Engels really does seem to be using authority, or the related terms like enslavement, domination, rule, etc., in a way much broader than his definition seems to provide for. There's another important difference in these other examples. These types of interpersonal authority exist because social structure and mode of production. Money has real social power, not because of any inherent feature of gold or paper, but because we live in a market-based society which attributes this power to it. By contrast, a factory is presented by having power, quote, independent of all social organization. It does seem to be an inherent characteristic of the factory that combined action is needed to operate it, and therefore authority. If this is what Engels means, it seems to be an odd form of argument. Regardless of which interpretation we adopt, or perhaps even entirely a different one, if scholars on Marx can find more direct connections, Engels' argument appears to be something along these lines. Quote, the anti-authoritarians claim that socialists are striving for a world without authority. They concede that the socialist society will have factories, but factories require many workers to be organized and coordinated. This also means it requires the will of the individual worker to be subordinated to the direction of a common plan of action, either by the system of delegates or by majority vote. Since the worker has been subordinated and is therefore still an authority, there therefore is still an authority ruling over the worker. Therefore, the so-called anti-authoritarian socialism will have authority after all. End asterisk. This example also seems to indicate that Engels really has one of the broader interpretations of imposition in mind, too. Presuming that the delegates is not breaking out the people's stick to beat the workers into following a schedule they write up. What makes it authoritarian is the mere fact that people need to act to concert with one another, following a common plan, and therefore the authority of whoever makes the plan. The argument may extend to other areas that require combined action, any activity that requires the complication of mutually dependent processes, and that's not just a factory. Whether it's performing in a band or going on a road trip or playing a game of football or a romantic couple planning a dinner night, multiple people must coordinate their schedules and actions together to a common plan, making these inherently authoritarian ways of relation, or so the logic goes. Just as some anarchists have objected how Engels assumes factory production must use child labor because it is how it is done under capitalism, he also seems to overstate the need for a common plan and downplaying the existence of autonomy within the factory. This is easily demonstrated by the essence of work to rule labor protests, where workers following only exact instructions of their contractor refusing to work exactly as directed. This appears to be a real oversight on Engels' part, given how strongly he asserts the autonomy does not exist in the factory. But a proper anarchist reply to Engels' argument does not need to demonstrate the existence of autonomy in the factory, but addresses Engels' argument about the need for administration. Even if administration is not needed for every action, it does appear to be necessary for some. And we're going to stop there. For today, we'll come back on part 5 and our part 4. Like and subscribe, hit the bell. We have a Patreon. There's all kinds of stuff behind that Patreon paywall. You can get access to the audio for as little as $3, and $5 to get you additional video, and $10 gets you commission something once a year. Have a great day. Like and subscribe.